That's good. I think I've got about 15 questions that have come up in the chat, and they're coming up more or less in the order that the speakers spoke in. So what we'll do is we'll just take them in the order they came, because they've come in as people were speaking, but we'll just take them in as they come. And what I'll try and do is I will read out the name of the person and roughly what it's about, and then get them to ask a question. So I don't know, Alison, are people allowed to unmute now?
Let me just do that.
Well, the first question will be from Javier, who has a question addressed to Paul about something that Toyota are developing. So Javier, if you're there, I can see you actually.
Yeah. Hello, guys. Well, it is just that Toyota announced an internal combustion engine that works with hydrogen, burning hydrogen. And I think this is a great opportunity, and wanted to speak about this particular announcement because I think it's a big opportunity. Most of the technology is already known and is very well developed, and it's just adapting to burning hydrogen and obviously not releasing any CO2. What do you guys think about this particular announcement, if you heard about that before?
Should we let Paul have a first go? But I mean,
yeah, I mean, I can certainly talk about the history of internal combustion engines for hydrogen. So it's quite feasible to adapt an internal combustion engine to use hydrogen, either together with diesel or hydrogen on its own. So in the late 90s, BMW produced a hydrogen-powered model. That used liquid hydrogen storage rather than compressed hydrogen. And the reason was because internal combustion engines are much less efficient than fuel cells. So in order to have a long enough range to be viable, they needed to use liquid hydrogen. And the trouble with liquid hydrogen is it boils off. The boiling point is about minus 270 degrees C. And so practically, no matter how unless you have an active cooling system on your car, which cars don't, we turn them off and they're off. It tends to boil, and then when it boils, you need to vent it. And so after 3 days, your tank was empty because all of the hydrogen had boiled off. And so liquid hydrogen isn't a brilliant fuel to use. Now, they could have used gaseous hydrogen, but the problem with that was that you didn't have the range. And that's been the fundamental issue with using internal combustion engines. The other issue maybe is that hydrogen's a more expensive fuel than petrol or diesel, and you're using a lot more of it per kilometer with an internal combustion engine. So this technology has been done. Another company which James mentioned, Elenco, are in the business of converting vans to use hydrogen in internal combustion engines, and that's working, and they're doing that at the moment. But it's a slightly more special case using a van than a general car. So it's something that's quite feasible. It's just there's range issues that you have. Fuel cells are so much more efficient that if you can bring down the cost of a fuel cell, you would want to do it. And from what I did have a look at the web link, so thank you for sharing that. And the Toyota car is very much designed at kind of petrol heads who want the feel of an internal combustion engine car without the emissions in the future, as opposed to something that they expect to have any sort of mainstream impact in terms of how we use cars in the future.
Okay.
Okay, James, do you want to say anything, or Catherine?
Well, you mentioned the efficiency, and I was a little bit impressed by that, because I know the internal combustion engines are not very efficient, but the process of converting hydrogen into electricity is not efficient either. I don't know exactly the figures, but if you can elaborate a little bit.
Well, we'll come on to that in a minute.
Yeah, there's going to be questions on that.
There's another question.
And we got now 16 or 17 questions, so we don't have a lot for each question.
Yeah.
James, do you want to say anything on that one though, or Catherine? No.
Nothing major for me. I was just going to point to the maritime application as being a key area where I think combustion is being considered, just because it's a bit more of a like for like. I'm not entirely sure why actually, but it seems to me that. Sorry.
Okay, I think
for large ships, combustion engines are much more efficient, so they can go up to 40-50%, whilst for cars they tend to be about 20%. So
There we go.
So there's a much smaller gap between fuel cells and combustion engines on a very large scale.
Okay, next question is from Rob Hunter about aircraft. Rob, are you there? Do you want to ask your question? I could ask it for you if you're not. It's quite nice to have audience participation if it's possible. No? Right, Rob, I'm going to read out Rob's question. I've read that they're going to trial hydrogen aircraft for the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, as they can produce hydrogen cheaper on a large scale. Is that viable globally? I think, James, you actually showed a picture of an aeroplane, so you might have I might get you to go first.
Yes, we're involved actually in a project looking at hydrogen aviation next generation zero emission aviation based out of Kirkwall Airport. So this is an area of interest of mine. I think the question's kind of in two parts though. So the first answer is yes, I suppose. Hydrogen-based aviation is on the agenda certainly, and I guess the opportunity there is a similar one to the other application we've talked about, and the challenges are similar to those that we've talked about. I think the major challenge is the storage and how you would ensure that you have enough hydrogen to usefully fly X distance, but that there may be advantages to using hydrogen in an aviation context relative to batteries because hydrogen is lighter, is probably the short answer there. In terms of the supply side of the hydrogen itself, I think there's a compelling argument for the availability of comparatively cheap hydrogen in the Highlands and Islands as a result of the vast build out that we can foresee for offshore wind. So there is a clear case for the future where a hydrogen based scenario is perhaps more likely in islanded and rural locations, I think, in the north of Scotland as a result of the supply dynamics locally. So I could imagine that hydrogen may be cheaper to supply in Orkney, for example, than it might be elsewhere in the UK or elsewhere globally. I'm not sure if that answers the question sufficiently directly, but that's.
Does anyone else want to add something to that one?
I can add something. I mean, as James says, there's an energy density issue here. Hydrogen is more energy dense than batteries, particularly if it's liquefied hydrogen, but it's still far less energy dense than jet fuel, and that's a big issue for global use of hydrogen. There is a big project that's ongoing to look at very quietly, so it's due to report in a few months, I'm told. But this is a little bit hearsay on use of ammonia for medium range aircraft, sort of about 300 to 4,000 kilometers, because ammonia has about twice the energy density of liquefied hydrogen. Airbus have been looking at liquefied hydrogen, but the trouble is you lose the back half of your plane. In order to store it, you lose, so as well as using under the wings, you're using part of the fuselage, the back part of the fuselage as well. And that's a little bit of an issue, plus the fact that you need to keep it at minus 270 degrees C when you're going. So in the future, again, we might have a range of fuels where up to 300 miles, you could use batteries. 300 to 4,000 kilometers, you could be using ammonia, and beyond 4,000 kilometers long haul, you're into synthetic fuels.
Okay. All right, this might be quite a quick question from Nicola's asked me to ask this one, and that is, it's referring really to one of the slides that Paul was showing about synthetic fuels. And the question is, could these synthetic fuels be used to replace domestic heating oil? I guess that's a type of heating system that's very common in the rural parts.
The short answer is yes, but it's probably quite an expensive method. It would probably be too expensive, would be my guess, compared to electrification. So if you're living in a rural area, you have plenty of space, you're probably better putting in a heat pump. Hydrogen is better in cities where you've got a very limited space, say in flats, for your actual heating system. And hence you don't want something as big as a heat pump. This is the graph at the bottom that I was asked to show.
Oh, thank you. Which
just shows that the largest and the oldest houses have a much higher. Let's see if we can make that bigger. have a much higher
Energy demand.
demand in winter than the smaller insulated houses. So it drops down to a similar level in summer for all houses, but there's a huge difference in winter. So that's why insulation is so important.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from our host, Alison, about blue hydrogen. Alison.
Yes, let me find my question because I have quite a lot. Oh yeah. Yeah, so basically, it's, when we're looking at hydrogen, there's only so much we can make with green. So my question is, how reliant are we on making so-called blue hydrogen? And given that we really haven't got the ability to make that at the moment, how feasible is it really to be thinking about that in large scale in the next kind of 10, 20, 30 years?
So at the minute, we don't have a CCS system. You need some sort of carbon capture and storage system. It depends what you're using the blue hydrogen for. So if you're going to decarbonize an industrial cluster, for example, we've got 7 in the UK we're looking at, then immediately you might have a very high demand for hydrogen. Presume most of those are sitting on the coastline, and it would presumably not be too expensive to dig a pipe out to the sort of North Sea gas field and start pumping the CO2 in there. Actual CO2 storage has been tried in a number of places. It's been done in the North Sea for quite a long time, several decades, at Sleipner in the Norwegian field. So as far as we're aware, it works. I mean, there might be issues about costs of building the actual hydrogen production plant itself. The gas steam methane reforming plant with CCS. There are 2 or 3 that are operating worldwide, mainly in the USA. And the CO2 is generally used for enhanced oil recovery. So it's, they're not green plants, but they are CCS plants. So the technology more or less works. The UK is investigating using autothermal reformers, which are a little bit different. They're more efficient than the standard SMR design. So this is something, again, Johnson and Matthey have a design for, and they work much better at lower outputs. So at low capacity factors, they're just as efficient as at high capacity factors, while SMR plants aren't. And the capture rates can be very high. So I think Catherine talked about a capture rate of about 91%, which is pretty typical for existing plants. Johnson Matthey think you could get it to at least 96% in an autothermal plant. But in the long term, if you're going for net zero emissions, whatever emissions you have, you need to offset somehow. So the question about if what happens, well, there's an underlying question about what if CCS doesn't work, and I think my answer is if CCS doesn't work, then we're not going to have a net zero energy system. It's not achievable. You need to have the negative emissions from biomass to CCS and from direct air capture. Otherwise, you can't offset your farming emissions, never mind anything from the energy system. And you're not going to be able to stop all of your farming emissions and land use emissions. But it's a technology that should work because it's been tested in a variety of places. The other thing that maybe comes down to is cost. So would it be cheaper? In the long term, we could probably build enough renewables for green hydrogen if we wanted to, and we could build enough blue hydrogen if we wanted to. I mean, there's the scale issue that green hydrogen is much more capital intensive, blue hydrogen is much more fuel cost intensive. But it comes down to cost. What might be the cheapest way? It's hard to say. They're pretty close, to be honest. I think we have blue hydrogen as being cheapest in our model, in our UK model, but only just, and that's even after offsetting the emissions with negative emissions from elsewhere in the system.
Okay, there's stuff in the chat on this issue as well. You could have a look at. Dave's put something up a bit ago. If Dave is who I think it is, he knows what he's talking about. And the next question, James or Catherine, do you want to add to that point about blue? Or not?
No, I think Paul did a good sort of overview there, and I think it's one of those things that, yeah, it needs to be considered going forward. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to meet the UK's net zero transition, because we need to consider sort of net zero technologies moving forward. But I think Dave has sort of made a good point that, yeah, it is a high cost process, but it's one that'll effectively be necessary if we're going to be able to generate And it might even, well, the way I've been looking at it is more of a sort of interim technology just now, as sort of we transition towards renewables. Can we introduce CCS into sort of the non-renewable side of things, especially when things like Scotland are going to get rid of all their nuclear power? Well, they're going to close down their nuclear power stations going forward. So how we can generate to make that gap in sort of the interim period is possible using something like CCS. So how can we? So I think it'll be something that we need to sort of consider going forward. It's just making sure that we can actually integrate it in, which, as Paul sort of highlighted, it is a method that has been used sort of successfully elsewhere. So.
But to comment on Dave's question, he noted that CCS has a huge energy consumption. It can be quite substantial for electricity from something like coal, where you have post-combustion capture and you need to capture the CO2 from the upward stream. For steam methane reforming plant, or the autothermal plants in particular, essentially you have natural gas coming in and you have hydrogen and CO2 coming out as separate streams. And so you can get a high pressure, pretty pure stream of CO2 that you don't need to clean up in the same way that you do. And so the loss of the actual energy cost is pretty low to capture it compared to putting it to the atmosphere.
Okay, and there's more stuff going on in the chat here from people who know what they're talking about. I want to move to the next question, which is from Jay Loader, and I think Jay Loader is here. Jay, are you interested in asking your question?
Oh, yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. The thing that hit me most, amongst other things, was the distribution maps that Paul showed. And my concern is that we sometimes tend to look at the big systems and forget that at the end of the day, unless you're on a mainline motorway or a mainline track, it's very much a localized individual problem. And one of the advantages that is sometimes put for all our spread of turbines, excuse me, around Scotland, is that instead of pouring some of that electricity straight into the ground, which is what for various reasons does happen, how easy would it be for the men who are actually putting the turbines on their ground to get their local fuels for their tractors and such like off their own local conversion process? In other words, we're not looking at a major distribution network to get stuff out to where it's actually needed. We're saying, wait a minute, we're starting there. Can we actually not put it into a network? Well, the other part of my question was, on the long term, major distribution networks, pipelines and so on, as the oil and gas goes down, will we get to a point where we'll have ready-made pipelines which can be converted to passing hydrogen?
Okay, a couple of good questions there. Who wants to start with that? Start on that one.
I can.
Brian, Paul.
I've been talking a lot, so if James and Catherine want to come in, they're very welcome. I mean, so for your first question, refueling, two issues of pressure and purity. So a car, the typical hydrogen compressed fuel tank has 700 bar hydrogen in it. Now in a tractor, you've probably got something less. You might only have, say, 350, but it's still going to be pretty high. And so you need some sort of compressor built into your home system. So the first question is, yes, you can. I mean, the first answer is yes, you can generate the hydrogen at home. You can have a small scale electrolyzer, and electrolyzers are to a certain extent scalable. You know, they do become a bit cheaper as you make them bigger, but particularly if you're looking at, say, PEM, proton electrolyte membrane electrolyzers, they're quite scalable in terms of cost. So it's quite feasible to do that. It's probably not an efficient way to produce hydrogen because it's very, very local. And so you're going to have a lot of swings up and down. So your capacity factor on your electrolyzer is going to be low. So your capital costs are relatively high. Then you need to compress the stuff to 300 bar. The other thing you need to think about is purity. So that'll depend on whether you're using an internal combustion engine or a fuel cell on your tractor. If you're using an internal combustion engine, then no problem at all. You can just chuck the stuff in there from just about any hydrogen source. If you're using a fuel cell, then there might be a little bit much water comes out when you have to go comes out of the electrolyzer. So an electrolyzer will produce all very, very pure hydrogen, but there will be some water in there, and most compressors can't cope with that water. So you normally have to dry the hydrogen, which loses some of your hydrogen in the drying process, and then you put it into the then you compress it. And then often actually you add a bit of water at the end, because it does need to be a little bit damp, but you just can't have that water in the compressor. And so you've got those issues as well. So you've got a fairly complex little system with a pretty low capacity factor, and you're probably better just exporting the stuff to the grid and letting somebody do it on a larger scale. They'll be able to do it more cheaply. So that would be my guess. But yeah, it's feasible.
I think James wants to come in.
Yeah, just a very brief counter. I was just going to say, unless you can't export to the grid because you're constrained by infrastructure, which is the be all and end all of the Orkney case, really. And I could see that being replicated elsewhere where there are similar constraints on the infrastructure. So that's a happy enabler of the challenges that have impeded other energy system projects. So that's my extra 2 cents.
Okay, can we move on to the next question? That is from Bob Pringle, who glad someone's asked this question. But Bob, you are there?
Yes, it's just if you're producing green hydrogen from renewable devices like wind turbines or solar panels, surely it's better to use it directly as electricity than to convert it into hydrogen, which is then converted into electricity to drive a vehicle.
Anyone answer that one?
I mean, I have slides on this because people always ask this, but not many. Do you want me to talk about it a bit? So I mean, so if we're going to, we've all been very positive about hydrogen in this talk so far, and perhaps we should play devil's advocate. So here's a proper devil's advocate, which is a professor of mechanical engineering at Cambridge. Doesn't get more kind of part of the grandeur than that in academic terms. And he said, energy conversion processes required by the green hydrogen economy are very inefficient, wasting energy's low-grade heat. A huge amount of renewable energy capacity would be needed to compensate for the wasted energy. The proposed green hydrogen economy is unlikely to be realizable in the UK because of the sheer amount of renewable electricity required, the low technology readiness level of large-scale electrolysis, and the undeveloped technology for storing hydrogen in salt caverns. Which is basically a mix of truths and half-truths, which leads to a conspiracy theory that it's a fossil fuel industry con, which I mean, you could actually back up a little bit. The fossil fuel industry is certainly pushing hydrogen, but that doesn't mean it's a bad option. Okay, so this is kind of the alternative view. Some of this is nonsense. We've been storing hydrogen in salt caverns for decades in the UK, quite happily. We have some that we used and we eventually decommissioned because we stopped using the plants that they were supplying. It's silly. But in terms of your actual question, there's a famous paper here from Ulf Bossel about whether a hydrogen economy makes sense. And this is what David Sabon is talking about with the loss of low-grade heat. So if you start off with 100 kilowatt hours of renewable electricity at the top, then if you follow the electric vehicle braking on the right, you end up with 70 kilowatt hours in your car being supplied to the wheels. And if you follow the fuel cell vehicle, depending which route you take, you end up with 23 kilowatt hours or 19 kilowatt hours. So it's only about a third of the efficiency. Now, I'm not going to, I could argue a little bit with this diagram, but I'm not going to argue with the overall message it's giving you on those numbers. Okay, they're more or less reasonable, I think. So that begs the question: well, why are we talking about hydrogen vehicles at all? And the reason is because that although batteries have much higher powertrain efficiencies, we don't actually care too much about the powertrain efficiency here. We care about the vehicle efficiency, which is the kilowatt hours per kilometer, not the kilowatt hours per kilowatt hour of powertrain efficiency. It's quite different to powertrain efficiency because it depends on the weight of the car. And that depends on how far you want your car to be able to drive. So the further you want your car because batteries are very heavy, the further you want your car to drive, the more batteries you need to put in. And you get something called mass compounding, because as you put more batteries in, the weight goes up and the vehicle efficiency goes down. until you eventually get to a point where you add more batteries and your range actually reduces. It stops increasing. And so you need to worry about the range when you decide this, because the energy efficiency is not fixed, or at least the vehicle efficiency isn't fixed. So that's one thing you need to worry about. Hydrogen is much lighter than batteries, and so doesn't have by any means the same problem for range. The second thing you need to think about is that we don't normally decide what technology to use based on the efficiency, or the exergy would be the technical term for this. So we tend to go for the lowest cost option rather than the more efficient option. How battery vehicles have been around for a century. We had battery vehicles before we went to internal combustion engine vehicles. Now, internal combustion engine vehicles have an efficiency of about 20%. Batteries, we just saw 80%, and fuel cell vehicles, maybe fuel cells are about 40%. So we currently continue to use the most inefficient option, and that's because efficiency isn't what we aim for. So that's the reason. That's my little presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, Catherine's presentation highlighted this as well, in a way, didn't you? With the amount of land that's going to be required if we go hydrogen or.
Yeah, so I mean, as I think I mentioned that if we transition to sort of 100% cars, buses, and trains, we're going to need about 3 times the amount of land area that would be required if we were sort of using 100% electric cars, buses, and trains. But as I guess one of the key messages I wanted to sort of portray within my presentation is that it's likely to be a combination of both hydrogen and electric transport methods that are going to be sort of needed going forward because of the disparity of how people live in the UK. So I think it's about 50 people in Scotland. I think it's similar in across the UK, live in rural areas. And I know I've got some questions about this sort of later on, about actually how do people use transport in rural areas, but encouraging people to transition from internal combustion engine vehicles to a low emission vehicle is actually quite a challenge in itself. And getting people onto buses is a bigger challenge. So with the reason why people travel in terms of the cost and convenience and, the status of having their own vehicle and all these sort of other sort of reasons themselves, are sort of key things as to why people are continuing to use cars. And if we can encourage people to use other low emission transport options, then that's sort of one step in the right direction towards our net zero target. And as hydrogen transport generally has a much larger range than electric transport, that sort of mitigates one of the key barriers to low carbon transport. So if we can encourage sort of hydrogen cars as opposed to internal combustion engine cars or plugins, because plugins aren't actually that great either, then I guess it's a step in the sort of more positive direction. Although, yes, I understand that actually hydrogen has a much larger impact on the environment, but as we've both sort of highlighted, that actually it's much, much less than sort of your internal combustion engine alternatives.
James?
Again, I would just say I think it depends on the context. So I think in an island context, you don't necessarily care at all about efficiency. You just need a ferry to to take you from A to B, and it's maybe hydrogen is more convenient than a battery in that instance, for example. So it's less quantitatively interesting to think about which is the most efficient option, and to both points that both speakers have made, it's about picking the right thing for the solution. I think that will encourage the transition the quickest.
Okay, I'll go on. The questions have been coming in just about as fast as we've been answering them, so we're not going to get to the bottom of them. We'll save the chat, and maybe for the speakers, you might be just interested in having a look at those questions, because we'll not get to answer them all. And Alison, just jump in when you want to curtail this to do the final wrap
we'll
up.
go to the end. We'll go to 9 o'clock and see.
Okay. Right, I'm going to read out James's question. That's the next one. So this is, I'll read out exactly as he's written it. He says, there's a theoretical idea has been talked about of using oil and gas infrastructure to provide hydrogen created from offshore wind farms. How feasible is this idea, and how long do you think it could be before we see an example of that? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I think it's quite a layered question, actually. I think there are intentions to look at using oil and gas platforms to host electrolysis facilities. And then there are also thoughts about using oil and gas transport infrastructure to move hydrogen around once you've made it. So I think both are interesting, and they serve slightly different needs and address slightly different challenges. I think when you think about building offshore wind further and further from shore, particularly if we go floating and it's really far offshore to take advantage of heavy wind way out, then we need to think about how we get the power back if we use a conventional make power, stick it in a cable and bring it to shore kind of model. And in that instance, there is an argument. I think there's more work to be done, but there's an argument that instead making hydrogen offshore and transporting gas might be more convenient. So we have experience, expertise, and infrastructure to transport gas. Let's use it. And I think it's a very there's a clear case for doing that off Scotland in the North Sea, where the infrastructure is there and will be out of use. The feasibility, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in this by any means, but as I understand it, the feasibility is it's viable. It would require changes in infrastructure. It would require likely upgrades in pipes and so on, but it's possible. I think the latter part of the question, how long will it be before we do it? I think that's not one that I certainly am able to answer. I think it's an open question. I would like to think we could see that happening in the context of a research project fairly soon. I think there's demand to take forward this idea and test it in practice. We'd be very happy to be involved. It probably goes without saying, but I think actually doing that commercially, there are quite a few steps to prove in the meantime, probably. So across the whole host of the different challenges that arise in that context, we have to demonstrate that you can actually feasibly operate a hydrogen production plant away from people, where you can't just turn up and fix it if it breaks, and those kind of aspects. So there are challenges to overcome first, but I think it's an idea that has some water, I suppose.
Thanks, James. That was addressed to you. Okay to move on, folks? Susan Smith, or I'll say actually, if I understand a slightly related question, so I'll just quickly read it out because she's asking about the feasibility of an inter-island pipeline to you, James. So yeah.
It's a very good question, and we haven't actually done any practical work on it yet because we're not transporting volumes of hydrogen that would make it necessary, but we'll get to that point fairly quickly, and it would be an awful lot more convenient than having to charter a ferry every time we have some gas to move. So it's something I'm keenly interested in. It's something that would make my job easier. So yes, it's the short answer. It's hopefully something we'll be demonstrating in the not too distant future.
Okay, the next person is Alison. Do you want to ask your question, or
No, I've already had one. I'll let
okay. I'll go to Per then. Per, I see you there. So Per Arno, you want to ask about curtailing electricity generation. Can you ask the question?
Yeah, it was really just, I think it was on the slide there. There's this element of if you are generating hydrogen, or how easy it to switch from sending electricity to the grid to generating hydrogen and storing it.
The switch.
I'm loath to give a generalized answer because I only really know about our case, but in our case, it's very straightforward because the wind turbines are curtailed all of the time because we just don't have the infrastructure to get the power out. So in our case, it's straightforward in that the operator has an amount that they can export and they know that and they can sort of plan around that. In a future that you would have hopefully a more flexible plant operation, I believe it's relatively straightforward to decide, on a relatively active timescale, half an hour ahead, for example, to choose where you're likely to get the best return, essentially, because I think that's what it comes down to. We're actually working with an organization called H2Go Power. So they're a London-based startup who have a hydrogen production plant that is essentially designed to address that exact need. So it's to be operated using an AI algorithm that will take into account the energy system context for the plant and move to make hydrogen when it makes most sense and ensure that the renewable asset exports the power when it doesn't. So that challenge is being addressed. I think in our context, it's very straightforward because the operator is so challenged that actually our plant is a great opportunity for them on their doorstep. Yeah.
Okay. I will move on. Maybe time for one more question. Jackie has it makes me laugh a little bit, this question. Why is it acceptable to have passengers on a hydrogen fueled bus or a car but not on a ferry? It's a very interesting question. James.
So I caught it in the chat and I thought, Jackie, I don't know. That's a very good question. And for some reason that hasn't occurred to me before in my battles with the Maritime Coast Guard Agency. I think the short answer is probably that when you are on a vessel, you're less able to get help in the event of an emergency. I think that's why I would understand the slightly more stringent approach. But I don't have a good answer because it is illogical. So please join us in lobbying for hydrogen-fueled vessels, by all means.
Have we got time for one more, Alison?
Well, I guess it's up to everyone else. If people want to stay, then they can stay. I mean, I don't mind holding the Zoom up for longer. So maybe one more. That will be it though, because maybe our speakers need a rest too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll do one more. Dave, if this is Dave, I think it is. Are you still there? Asking about hydrogen trains and wired trains. If not, maybe we should. Maybe that's a sign that we should stop there. If Dave's not there. Uh-oh. What's that, Dave?
Maybe. I don't think they're able to say anything.
Dave, that's a very strange noise that we can hear. Dave Simmons. Okay, Alison, I think we could shorten a day, but thanks everyone for those questions. I mean, it's a shame we can't do them all, but thanks everyone.
I know, and it's always the same at our Climate Cafe. So we run out of time before we run out of questions, which is good because it means you're all really engaged. And so hopefully we will get some of these answers later, but we will obviously be on a related topic next month with CCS. So it's a good to come to both of these Climate Cafes. You gain a really good understanding of both hydrogen and then how hydrogen can be made using CCS, and obviously the other uses that CCS can be put to that we've discussed today already as well. But listen, I'd like to give us, everyone can unmute themselves and give a huge big thanks and a round of appreciation to our speakers, and that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, please do look at it again. It's all going to be on the YouTube, it's on our Facebook, and come along to our next Climate Cafe as well. And take care, everyone. Have a great night. Bye-bye.